His fork was already in his mouth when I reached across the table and pulled the plate away from him mid-bite. He stared at me, still chewing, completely stunned. My manager was already walking toward us, asking me, in front of the entire table, what I thought I was doing. I did not have an answer that would have made sense to anyone standing there. Nobody understood why. Not the customer, not my manager, not even me. Not fully, not yet. I tell stories like this every week, about people who acted first and explained later. If that feels familiar, stick around and subscribe. Okay, let me walk you through how that night really went. My name is Elena Marsh, and the restaurant was called the Harbor House, a seafood place on the edge of town that had been open for 11 years and had a regular crowd of people who came back every single week for the same 3 or 4 dishes. My manager was a woman named Renata Voss, and if you ever met her, you would understand immediately why nobody who worked there ever tried to cut corners around her. She had been in the restaurant business for 22 years, 12 of them at the Harbor House, and she ran that kitchen and dining room with a kind of calm precision that made everyone around her better at their jobs without her having to raise her voice. She was not the kind of manager who yelled. She did not need to. She noticed everything, and she corrected mistakes quietly, and she was, by every measure I had, one of the most reasonable people I had ever worked for. The man at the table was named Walter Combs. He was probably in his early 60s, and he came in almost every Thursday night with his daughter, a woman named Priya, who worked at the hospital across town and always ordered a glass of the house white before she even looked at the menu. Walter always ordered the same dish, always, the lemon butter halibut, wild caught, with a side of roasted fingerling potatoes and asparagus. He had been ordering it for years, according to 2 of the other servers who had worked there far longer than I had. He was, by every account, one of the easiest regulars in the building, polite, predictable, generous with his tips, the kind of customer that made a slow Thursday shift feel worth it. I was 3 weeks into the job that night, still learning the layout of the kitchen, still memorizing which side dishes came with which entrees, still nervous every time I carried a tray with both hands because I had dropped one during training, and I had not forgotten the sound it made when it hit the floor. I am telling you this so you understand something important. I was not confident. I was not the kind of new employee who walked around thinking she knew better than the people who had been there for years. If anything, I spent most of that first month trying not to be noticed, trying to just get through each shift without making a mistake that someone would have to fix. So when I say that, I pulled a plate away from a customer, a regular, a man who tipped well and never complained about anything, in front of my manager, without being able to explain myself in the moment. I need you to understand how unlike me that was. It was not an impulse. It did not come out of nowhere. It came from something I had been noticing, quietly, for the better part of 20 minutes before it happened. And by the time my hand actually moved, I was not acting on a feeling. I was acting on a decision I had already made in my head, slowly, piece by piece, the way you decide something is true only after you have turned it over enough times that you cannot talk yourself out of it anymore. It started with the smell. I carried Walter's plate out from the kitchen myself that night, which was not unusual, since I had been assigned to his section along with 2 other tables. The halibut looked the way it always looked, at least at first glance, pale, flaky, glazed with the lemon butter sauce that the kitchen made fresh in small batches throughout the night. I had carried that exact dish to other tables earlier in the shift, twice, and I remembered what it smelled like, because smell is one of those things you do not consciously study, but your body remembers anyway. Bright, citrus forward, a little bit of garlic underneath, nothing unusual. But when I picked up Walter's plate from the past that night, There was something underneath the lemon that was not there before. It was faint. It was the kind of thing you could easily talk yourself out of noticing. And for the first minute after I set the plate down in front of him, I did talk myself out of it. I told myself I was imagining things, that the kitchen had probably just used a slightly different pan, or that the butter had browned a little more than usual, or that I was simply tired and my senses were playing tricks on me the way they do near the end of a long shift. Walter did not notice anything. He never did. He picked up his fork the way he always did, cut into the fish, and started eating while he talked to Priya about something happening at her hospital. Some new equipment they had installed that he did not fully understand, but was proud of her for using anyway. I stood near the server station for a moment, watching them from across the room, and I told myself the smell was nothing. I moved on to my other tables. I refilled water glasses. I took an order from a family of 4 near the window, and the whole time, some small and stubborn part of my brain would not let go of that smell. It took me almost 15 minutes to place it, and when I finally did, I felt something cold move through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Earlier that evening, before the dinner rush had fully started, I had walked past the far end of the kitchen line where one of the sous chefs, a man named Diego, was working on a special sauce for a dish that was not even on the regular menu yet, something the head chef wanted to test for the following week. I remembered seeing a pot on the back burner, and I remembered Diego telling me, almost in passing, not to worry about it, that it was just a shrimp stock reduction he was building for the new special. I had not thought about it again until that exact moment, standing near the server station, watching Walter take another bite of his halibut, because the smell underneath the lemon butter on his plate was the same smell that had been coming off that pot. Something faintly sweet, faintly briny, unmistakably shellfish. Once you knew what you were smelling for. And I knew because it was written on a small laminated card taped inside the server station, right next to the table assignments, that Walter Combs had a documented shellfish allergy on file, severe, the kind of note that every server was supposed to check before sending an order to the kitchen, the kind of note that existed specifically so that a mistake like this could never happen. I did not run over and grab the plate the second I figured it out. That is the part people get wrong when they hear this story later. I did not panic. I stood there and I thought it through, calmly, the way you would double-check a math problem before you commit to the answer. I thought about the smell from the pot. I thought about the smell on the plate. I thought about the laminated card. I thought about how easy it would have been for a busy kitchen, moving fast during a Thursday dinner rush, for a pan that had touched that shrimp stock to be reused, even briefly, even by accident, on something meant to go out completely clean. I thought about all of it, and by the time I started walking toward his table, I already knew what I was going to do. My hands were steady. My mind was quiet. In the particular way it goes quiet when you have stopped debating something with yourself and simply decided. I walked toward Walter's table, with my heart pounding in a way that felt less like fear and more like pressure building behind my ribs, the kind of feeling you get when you know you are about to do something that cannot be undone once you start it. Priya was mid-sentence, telling her father something about a new scanning machine at the hospital, and Walter had just cut another piece of the halibut and was lifting it toward his mouth when I reached across the table. I did not ask permission. I did not tap him on the shoulder or clear my throat or do any of the small, polite things a server is trained to do before interrupting a table. I reached out, took hold of the plate, and pulled it back toward me in one motion that was quick but not frantic, the way you would move if you were trying to catch something falling rather than trying to make a scene. Walter Fork was already at his lips. He had already taken the bite. His mouth was full when the plate slid away from him, and he looked up at me with an expression that was not angry yet, only confused, the kind of confusion that has not decided what it is going to turn into. Priya stopped talking mid-sentence. The table beside them, a couple I did not know, both turned to look, and within maybe 10 seconds, Renata was there, moving fast but not running, the way an experienced manager moves when she senses something has gone wrong and needs to control the situation before it becomes bigger than it already is. Renata asked me directly, in front of all of them, what exactly I thought I was doing. Her voice was not loud. It was not cruel. It was the voice of someone who had been doing this job for over 2 decades and had learned that the fastest way to de-escalate a strange moment in a dining room was to sound calm, even if you did not feel calm, because everyone around you takes their cue from your tone. She was looking at me, and then at Walter, and then at the plate I was now holding away from the table, and I could see her trying to piece together, in real time, whether I had lost my mind, whether I had dropped something on the floor and grabbed the wrong plate in a panic, whether this was some kind of joke that had gone wrong. I did not have a clean answer. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story and make it sound like I stood there and calmly explained the whole chain of reasoning, the pot, the smell, the laminated card, all of it in one smooth sentence, and everyone immediately understood. That is not what happened. What actually came out of my mouth was something much messier. I said that I thought there might be shellfish in the sauce. I said it fast, and I said it quietly, because I did not want to say the word allergy loudly enough for Walter to hear it and start panicking before I even knew for certain, and because some instinct in me did not want to embarrass him in front of his daughter over something that might still turn out to be nothing. Renata asked me how I knew that, and I did not have an answer that would have satisfied anyone standing there. I told her I smelled something off. I told her about the pot at the sous chef station earlier in the night. I told her about the laminated allergy card. But even as I said all of it out loud, I could hear how thin it sounded. A smell, a memory of a conversation from hours earlier, a guess. I was a server who had been at that restaurant for 3 weeks, standing in the middle of the dining room, holding a paying customer plate away from him mid-bite, based on nothing anyone could see or verify in that moment. Walter had finally finished chewing, and he looked between me and Renata with an expression that had settled into something closer to embarrassment than anger, the way people get when they realize other people around them are staring. He said gently that he had eaten that same dish probably 50 times over the years, and nothing had ever happened before. He was not upset with me exactly. He seemed more confused than anything, maybe even a little bit worried that I was the one having some kind of episode. Renata looked at me for a long moment. I want to describe this part carefully, because I think it says everything about who she was as a manager and as a person. She did not immediately dismiss me. She did not laugh it off or tell me to put the plate back down and apologize, but she also could not, reasonably, take the word of a 3-week employee over the visible reality in front of her, which was a long-time regular who had already eaten several bites of a dish he had ordered dozens of times without incident, based on a claim about a smell that only I said I noticed. She asked me, quietly, whether I was certain, and I told her the truth. I said I was not completely certain, not in a way I could prove, but that I was certain enough that I did not think anyone should keep eating that plate until someone checked. She asked me if I had told anyone in the kitchen about what I noticed before I pulled the plate. I had not. There had been no time, or at least it had not felt like there was time, because in my head, the 15 minutes I had spent turning it over already felt like an eternity of waiting, and the moment I connected the smell to the allergy card, the only thing that felt possible was moving. Renata excused herself and walked back toward the kitchen, and I remember standing there, still holding a plate of half-eaten halibut next to a table of people who did not know what to think of me, feeling the weight of every set of eyes in that section of the dining room. Priya asked her father if he felt strange, if his throat felt tight, if his lips felt swollen. All the questions you ask when you are trying to figure out in real time whether a moment is an emergency or an overreaction. Walter said he felt fine. He said it twice. The second time, a little more firmly, as if he wanted to reassure both his daughter and himself. I did not know, in that exact moment, whether I had just done something that would save a man from a severe allergic reaction, or whether I had just embarrassed a loyal customer, insulted the kitchen staff, and made myself look unstable in front of the person who had the power to decide whether I still had a job at the end of the night. Both possibilities felt equally real to me as I stood there. That is the part that people do not always understand about moments like this. You do not get the clarity of hindsight while you're living inside the moment itself. You only get a decision made with incomplete information, and then you get to find out afterward whether you were right. Renata came back out from the kitchen a few minutes later, and she was not alone. Diego, the sous chef, was walking behind her, and he did not look like a man who had been pulled away from his station to defend himself against an accusation. He looked like a man who had just been asked a question and was still working out the answer in his own head. Renata asked him directly, in front of me and in front of Walter Table, whether there was any possibility that the pan used for Walter dish that night had come into contact with the shrimp stock he had been reducing earlier for the new special. Diego hesitated. That hesitation told me more than anything he said afterward. He said that it was possible, that the kitchen had been busy, that pans got rotated quickly during a rush, and that while he always tried to keep allergen items separated, he could not say with 100% certainty that the exact pan used for Walter halibut that night had not, at some point earlier in the evening, held the shrimp stock before it was cleaned and reused. That was not a confession. It was not proof. It was an honest, reasonable admission of uncertainty from a hard-working cook who had no reason to lie and no way to be completely sure either. But it was enough to change the temperature of the moment. Renata thanked him, sent him back to the kitchen, and turned to look at me again. And this time, her expression had shifted into something more serious, something that told me she understood this was not simply a matter of a new server making a strange scene in the dining room. She told Walter, gently and clearly, that out of an abundance of caution, given his documented allergy, she wanted to have his dish tested before anyone assumed it was safe to continue eating it, and that in the meantime, she wanted to keep a close eye on him just in case. She asked him again how he was feeling, and this time she asked with the kind of attentiveness that told me she was taking the possibility seriously, even without proof, because the cost of being wrong in one direction, assuming everything was fine when it was not, was so much higher than the cost of being wrong in the other direction, pausing a meal to check. But even with Diego admission, even with Renata taking the situation seriously enough to pause the table and question the kitchen, there was still no actual proof that anything had gone wrong. No test result, no lab confirmation, nothing physical that anyone could point to and say, definitively, this is what happened. All we had was a smell that only I claimed to notice, a memory of a pot on a back burner, and a cook honest enough to admit he could not rule it out. For everyone else standing in that section of the dining room, for Walter, for Priya, for the couple at the next table who were now openly watching the entire scene unfold, it still looked like a new waitress had grabbed a regular plate away from him for reasons nobody could confirm. Renata turned to me one more time before she headed back toward the kitchen with the plate in her own hands, and she said something I did not expect. She did not scold me in front of everyone. She did not tell me I had done something wrong, but she also did not tell me I had done something right. She simply said that we were going to figure out exactly what happened, and that until we did, I should go take care of my other tables, because the entire dining room did not need to keep watching this unfold. It was, in its own way, the most professional thing she could have said in that moment, and it also happened to be the moment when I first understood that whatever came next, my job might genuinely be on the line, depending on what that plate turned out to prove. I went back to my other tables because Renata told me to, but I do not think I retained a single word any of my other customers said to me for the next 10 minutes. I was moving through the motions of the job, refilling water, clearing a dessert plate, writing down an order for a table of 4, while the entire time some part of my brain stayed fixed on the swinging door to the kitchen, waiting for it to open again, waiting to find out whether I had just done something necessary or something career-ending. The restaurant did not stop for what was happening at Walter Table. That is one of the strange things about working in a place like the Harbor House. Life around you keeps moving at full speed, even when your own personal crisis is unfolding 15 feet away. Other servers were still calling out orders. The bar was still mixing drinks. A birthday party near the back had just started singing to someone, off-key and enthusiastic, completely unaware that a few tables over, a woman they had never met was wondering if she still had a job by the end of the night. I want to pause here for a second, because I think this is the part of the story where a lot of people watching this would ask themselves the same question. I kept asking myself while I stood at that server station, pretending to organize silverware that did not need organizing. What would you have done? Not in theory. Not with the comfortable distance of watching a video about it after the fact, already knowing how it turns out. I mean, actually, in the moment, 3 weeks into a new job, with a manager you respect looking at you like she is trying to figure out if you have lost your mind, and a paying customer staring at you with his fork still halfway to his mouth. Would you have said something and risked looking foolish? Or would you have stayed quiet and told yourself it was probably nothing? I think about that a lot, actually, and I would genuinely like to know where you land on it, because I do not think there is an obvious right answer until you are the one standing there. Drop your honest answer below before you finish the rest of this story, because I think it changes depending on who is telling it. Diego, the sous chef, apparently went straight to the walk-in refrigerator after Renata sent him back to the kitchen because he wanted to check something for himself before anyone asked him to. One of the other line cooks told me about this part later, after everything had settled, and I believed him because he had no reason to make it up. Diego pulled the pan in question, the one that had been used for Walter halibut that night, out of the dish pit where it had already been placed for washing. It had not gone through the dishwasher yet. It was sitting in the 3-compartment sink, pre-rinsed but not yet run through the full wash and sanitize cycle. And when Diego picked it up and looked closely at the inside of it, near the seam where the metal curved up toward the handle, there was a faint residue that had not fully rinsed away. Not much. A thin film, the kind of thing that is easy to miss if you are not specifically looking for it, but unmistakably present if you are. He brought the pan directly to Renata, and I did not see this part happen, but I heard about it afterward from someone who did. He set it down under the light near the pass and pointed to that residue, and he said plainly that it looked like it could be from the shrimp reduction he had been working on earlier, and that if it was, it meant the pan had not been cleaned thoroughly enough between uses before someone grabbed it to plate Walter halibut. This still was not final proof. A residue under a kitchen light is not a laboratory test. It could have been something else. It could have been a coincidence. A bit of butter that had browned unevenly, a mark from the metal itself. Renata, being the kind of manager she was, did not treat this as confirmed just because it fit the story that was already forming. She had Diego bag the pan and set it aside completely untouched, and she picked up the phone at the host stand and called the restaurant supplier they used for food safety testing, the same company that handled their regular health inspections and occasional allergen verification when situations like this came up. It was not instant. It was not the kind of thing you see in a movie where a machine beeps and gives you an answer in 30 seconds. It took time and phone calls and someone from a small local lab agreeing to run a rapid allergen test on both the plate itself, which Renata had also kept untouched on a shelf in the walk-in, and the pan. While all of that was happening in the background, I was still working my section, and Walter and Priya were still sitting at their table, though the mood there had changed completely from what it had been 20 minutes earlier. Priya had stopped drinking her wine. She kept watching her father closely, asking him every few minutes how he felt, whether his throat felt normal, whether he noticed any tingling anywhere. Walter kept insisting he was fine, but I noticed, when I walked past their table to check on the couple beside them, that he had stopped eating entirely. His fork sat untouched on the edge of the plate that Renata had left in front of him after taking photos of it for reference, a plate that was now mostly performative since nobody expected him to actually keep eating it. Renata came to find me again about 20 minutes later. She pulled me aside near the server station, away from the main dining room, and for the first time since the whole thing had started, her expression was harder to read. She was not angry, I could tell that much, but she was serious in a way that made my stomach tighten because I still did not know which direction this was going to go. She told me that Diego had found residue on the pan, that she had sent both the pan and the plate out for testing, and that we would not have a confirmed answer for at least another hour, maybe longer, depending on how quickly the lab could turn it around. She said this to me evenly, without drama, the way she said most things, but then she asked me a question that I was not prepared for. She asked me why I had not simply told a manager or a kitchen staff member what I suspected before I acted, instead of pulling the plate away from a customer directly and creating a scene in front of the entire section. I understood why she was asking. I would have asked the same thing if I were in her position. There was a version of that night where I could have quietly flagged down a manager, pulled Renata aside, and explained what I thought I smelled, and let her decide how to handle it discreetly without a customer ever noticing anything was wrong. That version of the story exists, and it probably would have been the smoother path, the one that did not involve a paying customer sitting stunned with food still in his mouth while an entire section of the restaurant watched. But I told her the truth, which was that by the time I had finished putting the pieces together, Walter was already mid-bite, his fork already at his mouth for a second time, and every second I spent walking to find her or explain myself quietly felt like a second where he might take another bite, and possibly a bite that mattered more than the ones before it, since with allergies, exposure can sometimes build rather than announce itself all at once. I told her that I was scared of being wrong, but I was more scared of being right and having done nothing. Renata did not respond to that right away. She looked at me for a long moment, the same way she had looked at me back at the table, except this time there was something different underneath it, something that was not quite approval yet, but was no longer simple confusion either. She told me that she still could not make any final decisions about anything, my job included, until the test results came back, because the restaurant had procedures, and those procedures existed for a reason, and she was not going to bend them just because a situation felt emotionally compelling in the moment. She said that if the test came back and there was nothing in that pan, nothing on that plate, no trace of shellfish at all, then we were going to have a serious conversation about what had happened that night and what it meant going forward, because a restaurant cannot function if servers start pulling food away from paying customers based on hunches, however well-intentioned. I understood that. I did not argue with it. It was the reasonable thing for her to say, and some part of me, the part that had spent 3 weeks trying to become invisible and competent at the same time, was already preparing myself for the possibility that I had made a mistake that would end with me being let go before the night was over. Allergy or no allergy, because even a correct instinct handled the wrong way can still cost you something. The next hour was the longest hour I have ever worked in that restaurant. Before or since, I kept my head down and did my job as best as I could. But every time the kitchen door swung open, my whole body went tight, waiting to see if it was someone coming out with news. The lab technician called Renata directly on her cell phone a little over an hour after the pan and the plate had been sent out, and I only know the exact timing because I was standing close enough to the host stand to see her check her phone and step away from the front desk with the particular urgency of someone who has been waiting for a call and does not want to miss it. I did not hear the conversation. I was clearing a table on the far side of the dining room, and by the time I noticed Renata on the phone, she had already turned her back to the room and walked toward the small office behind the kitchen where she usually handled paperwork and vendor calls. I remember the feeling of that stretch of time, watching her disappear behind that door, knowing that whatever she heard on the other end of that call was going to determine a lot more than just whether Walter dinner had contained something dangerous. It was going to determine whether the last hour of my life had been an act of good judgment or a very public, very expensive mistake. She came back out about 8 minutes later, and she did not come find me first. She went straight to Walter's table, and I watched from across the room as she crouched down slightly beside his chair, the way people do when they want to speak to someone without the whole room overhearing, and she talked to him for a while, her expression steady, her hands folded in front of her, the way she always held them when she was delivering something important. Priya leaned in to listen too. I could not hear a single word, but I watched Walter face change while Renata spoke, and it changed in a way that told me everything before I ever got the full explanation myself. He went pale, not the frightened kind of pale, not the kind that comes from a sudden shock, but the slower kind, the kind that comes from realizing something that already happened could have gone very differently than it did. Renata finished talking to them, stood back up, said something else that made Priya reach over and take her father hand, and then she turned and walked toward me. I remember bracing myself in that moment, genuinely unsure whether I was about to be told I still had a job or whether I was about to be walked to the back office and let go, because even with what I now suspected the test had shown, I still did not know how Renata was going to weigh everything that had happened. The correct instinct against the unorthodox, public way I had acted on it. She told me the lab had confirmed shellfish protein present in both the residue on the pan and on the portion of sauce remaining on Walter's plate. Not a trace amount that could be explained away as background contamination from shared kitchen equipment in general. A meaningful amount, consistent with a pan that had recently held a concentrated shrimp stock and had not been adequately cleaned before being reused for a dish meant to go out completely free of shellfish. The report was specific. It was documented. It was, in every sense of the word, physical proof, sitting in a printed lab result that Renata was holding in her hand. Not a feeling, not a guess, not something that depended on anyone believing me. A measurable fact that existed independent of what I had said or how confident I had sounded while I said it. I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not fully realized was clenched until that exact moment. Relief, yes, but underneath the relief was something heavier too, because the confirmation also meant that if I had not pulled that plate away, Walter would have kept eating a dish that could have triggered a severe allergic reaction, the kind that Priya, working at a hospital, would have recognized as dangerous the moment his throat started to feel different, except by then it might have already been an emergency instead of a close call. Renata did not launch into a long speech. That was not her style. She told me, plainly, that I had been right, that the kitchen had made a serious error in cross-contamination that night, and that the restaurant took full responsibility for it. She said she was going to need to have a longer conversation with me later about the protocol I had used to act on it, because pulling a plate away without alerting a manager first was still something they needed to talk through for the future. But she said this without any heat in her voice at all, more like someone thinking out loud about training procedures than someone building a case to fire me. Then she said something I have thought about many times since that night. She said that in 22 years of doing this job, she had learned that the vast majority of the time, when a staff member insists something feels wrong, even without being able to fully explain why, they turn out to be overly cautious rather than accurate, and that caution itself is not a bad instinct to have in a kitchen. But she said that every once in a long while, someone new, someone without the experience to have talked themselves out of trusting their own senses yet, notices something that everyone else, herself included, would have completely missed, and that tonight had been one of those rare times. She did not say it like a compliment meant to flatter me. She said it like an honest observation from someone who had spent over 2 decades learning to tell the difference between the two. She walked back over to Walter's table with me beside her, and this time she asked me to speak directly to him myself, which surprised me because I expected her to handle the entire conversation on her own, given how serious the situation had become. But she told me, quietly, before we reached the table, that Walter deserved to hear directly from the person who had actually caught it, and that I deserved to be the one who told him, rather than standing off to the side while someone else got credit for a decision that had genuinely been mine. I explained it to Walter myself, the smell, the memory of the pot at Diego Station earlier in the night, the laminated card behind the server station with his allergy listed on it, the 15 minutes I had spent trying to convince myself I was imagining things before I finally decided I could not risk being wrong. Walter listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, he sat quietly for a moment, and then he said something that I have carried with me ever since. He said that he had been coming to that restaurant for years, that he trusted the kitchen completely, that he never once thought to double-check his own food because he had simply stopped expecting anything to go wrong. He said that it had taken someone who did not yet have the luxury of that kind of trust, someone still paying close enough attention to notice something the rest of them had stopped looking for, to catch what everyone else, including himself, had missed. Priya thanked me, too, more than once, and I could see in her face the particular kind of gratitude that comes from someone who works in medicine and understands exactly how quickly a situation like that can turn serious. She told me that severe shellfish reactions do not always announce themselves gradually. Sometimes they escalate fast, and the difference between catching something early and catching it late can be the difference between a frightening story you tell later and an emergency room visit, or worse. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant standing at that table. I did not feel like I had won anything. Mostly, I felt tired and a little bit shaky now that the adrenaline that had carried me through the last hour was finally starting to fade. And underneath all of it, I felt something quieter, something closer to relief, that I had trusted the version of myself that noticed the smell in the first place, instead of the version of myself that wanted to stay invisible and not make a scene. Renata still needed to figure out exactly how the cross-contamination had happened procedurally, whether it was a training gap, a rushed moment during the dinner service, a lapse in the usual pan labeling system they used for allergen items, and she spent the rest of that night working through it, with the kitchen staff even after the dining room had mostly cleared out. I was not part of most of that conversation. My job, for the remainder of the shift, was simply to keep working my section, which felt strange, going back to refilling water glasses and clearing plates after everything that had just happened. But there was also something steadying about it, a reminder that the restaurant kept running, that the world did not stop just because something enormous had almost happened, and then, because someone paid attention, did not. Before that night ended, Renata asked me to come into the small office behind the kitchen, the same room she had disappeared into, to take the call from the lab. I sat down across from her, and I remember thinking, even after everything that had already happened, that there was still a real possibility this conversation would end with me being let go, because being right about the allergy did not automatically erase the fact that I had broken protocol to act on it. She did not fire me. She told me, instead, that the restaurant was going to formally update its allergen handling procedures, starting with a much stricter system for labeling and separating pans used for shellfish preparations, something Diego himself had already started sketching out on a notepad before he even left the kitchen that night, because he wanted to make sure nothing like that ever happened again on his watch. She told me that she was going to document what happened, not as a disciplinary write-up, but as part of the incident report the restaurant was required to keep, and that my name would be in that report, attached specifically to the fact that I was the one who caught it. She also told me that going forward, she wanted me to come find her first if something like this ever happened again, not because I had done the wrong thing, but because the next new server who noticed something and was not sure how to handle it needed a clear procedure to follow, one that did not depend on someone being brave enough to act alone in front of an entire dining room. I told her that made sense to me. I meant it. I had not enjoyed those minutes of not knowing whether I still had a job, and I did not particularly want to repeat them. Walter and Priya stayed almost an hour longer than they normally did, and by the time they finally got up to leave, the kitchen had prepared Walter a completely new dish, cooked on freshly cleaned equipment, checked twice by Diego himself before it ever left the pass. Walter ate all of it. Priya watched him the entire time anyway, which I understood completely. On his way out, Walter stopped by the server station where I was rolling silverware into napkins for the next day's service, one of those small closing tasks that felt almost absurdly ordinary given everything that had just happened a few hours earlier. He did not make a big speech. He was not a dramatic man. He simply told me that he would be back the following Thursday, same time, same table, and that he hoped I would be working that section again. Then he reached into his pocket and left something folded on the corner of the station, not a tip, since he had already taken care of that with Renata directly, but a small card from the hardware store he owned across town, with his personal cell phone number written on the back in blue ink. And he told me that if I ever needed anything at all, I should call him. I still have that card. It is sitting in the drawer of my nightstand at home, a little worn at the corners now, and every so often I come across it while looking for something else, and I think about that whole night all over again. The smell I almost talked myself out of trusting. The 15 minutes I spent standing near the server station convincing myself I was not imagining things. And the moment my hand closed around the edge of that plate and pulled it back before he could take a second bite, that is the story of the night. I pulled a plate away from a man mid-bite, and the reason nobody, including me, could fully explain it until hours later, when a lab result finally said in writing what I had only been able to say out loud with a shaking kind of certainty that nobody around me had any reason to believe yet. If you have ever been the person nobody understood in the moment, the one who could not explain herself fast enough to be believed right away, I make videos like this every week about people just like that. Hit subscribe if you want to hear the next one, because there is always another story where somebody had to trust themselves before anyone else was ready to.